Hey everyone, back again. Let's finish off Eichmann in Jerusalem from chapter 13 till the end, including the epilogue. Now, before jumping into it, you know the drill. Go check out the previous episodes if you haven't already. Follow me on other platforms. Contribute to one of the organizations I've listed below. That would be really fantastic if you could do that. And yeah, let's jump into chapter 13 here. And in the last episode, we looked at the various ways in which parts of Europe began the processes of deporting Jewish people to the concentration camps to eventually be killed, most of them. And now we start with chapter 13, the killing centers in the East. The East referred to Poland in this context. Poland, Baltic states, and occupied Russian territory. Now, one of the other things we're going to get into here, at least toward the end, is a little bit more detail about the trial and the illegality around the trial, around Eichmann's arrest, without saying that therefore he didn't deserve to have this kind of trial. But the specific implications of having a trial held in Israel, which is meant to be the Jewish state, to try somebody who had specifically targeted Jews. Now, the actual details of that we've already demonstrated were not so neat. At least Eichmann's anti-Semitism was not so clearly on display. But in any case, the question that Hannah Arendt encourages us to ponder or to ask is whether or not it was possible for Eichmann to have a neutral, objective, bias-less trial in a state for the Jewish people whom he is being charged with having committed genocide against, or if the situation should have been that he should have been tried by an international court comprised of various people from all of the countries in which he played a part in deporting Jews to their death or to Palestine. Now, as far as the East goes, his connection to the East, his connection there was weak at best. This didn't stop the court, though, from welcoming a litany of witnesses to describe the horrors there without having any bearing on the case. And again, this contributes to the spectacle element of the Eichmann trial, where it was meant to be a show trial demonstrating the horrors of the Holocaust that actually had nothing to do with Eichmann's trial. Now, does this mean that the Jewish people were not allowed a venue to air their experiences so that others can bear witness to what happened to them? No. Is a court trial the place to do that? No, absolutely not. And again, because I have to be totally clear about this, and I want to be totally clear about this, of course he was guilty. And we knew this before the trial even happened. I wasn't alive at the time, but people obviously knew it. Now, all of these witnesses, or at least this detail, encourages us to ask, could this court be impartial? Obviously not. Eichmann was guilty. Obviously, he was guilty. But he was deemed guilty before he was even had his day in court. I mean, his guilt is what motivated his illegal kidnapping in the first place. They wouldn't have done that unless they were pretty sure he was guilty. And everyone knew it. Even though his name barely appeared, if it appeared at all, during the Nuremberg trials, despite this court trying to sell him or paint him as this architect behind the final solution. Now, Hannah Arendt, in a quippingly way, in a sarcastic way, points to the fact that because Eichmann had learned about the Jews, Jewish history, Jewish culture, Jewish aspirations, because he was part of Jewish affairs, he had learned about them by cooperating with Zionists and by reading Zionist texts, those Jews who wanted to leave Europe and settle somewhere else. Arendt says about this sarcastically, well then, who could better be qualified to try him than these three judges who had all been Zionists since their early youth? And she's saying this to be sarcastic and to encourage us to ask, what were Eichmann's connections to the Zionist movement, and how were Zionists treated differently than other Jews in Nazi Europe? Well, Nazi Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe, those European countries, you know what I mean? Not to mention his illegal arrest again, right? Because, this was, obviously messed up. This was done under the pretense of his having murdered 6 million Jews. And this is well known, of course, before he was actually kidnapped. And as this was outlined, like, for example, Prime Minister Ben Gurion had actually wrote a letter to the Argentinian president to be like, yeah, you can't retaliate against us, or you can't recall Eichmann back because of the horrors that he inflicted against the Jewish people. And of course, the Argentinian president wasn't going to resist this, and they didn't, but it was clearly it was still illegal nevertheless. And the point here, and it connects to the effort by the court to frame the Holocaust as being singly targeted against Jewish people, while erasing the way that it had gone after, or it had killed Roma people, disabled people, and so on, Poles, and so on, to make it all about Jewish people. And it's not as though they weren't the primary victim here. Of course that was the case. But in doing this, what happens is, and this was one of Hannah Arendt's more infamous points, is that they tried this case as a crime against Jews instead of a crime against humanity, which, in the case of genocide, is a crime against humanity. It's not a crime against a certain people. And if we lose sight of that, then we lose sight of the very value of humanity that we should all be protecting, or trying to protect. And in the case where Eichmann is abducted, his humanity is taken away. His rights are taken away, which Hannah Arendt is like, yeah, he's a Nazi, but he's still a human, which is we still need to acknowledge that. And as soon as we start taking away people's rights, this is a dangerous slope to leading to another horrible thing like the Holocaust. Or in her writings in The Origin of Totalitarianism, when she considers the hypocrisy and the irony of Jews having come out of the Holocaust and immediately doing committing atrocities against the Palestinian people by displacing, as soon as they got there, upwards of 1 million people would lose their homes and were thrown into refugee camps. And they had no power over this. And she's like, well, yeah, because Jewish people were branding themselves as being the sole victim of the Holocaust, and therefore it's they should have carte blanche. They should be able to do whatever they want in order to actually make amends with the world, which, whether or not that's the case, definitely a conversation to be had about the need of a Jewish state, given millennia of prosecution and persecution and violence. But at the expense of Palestinians? No. Absolutely not. So what exactly were they trying to charge him with? They were trying to charge him with mass slaughter at, excuse my pronunciation, Einsatzgruppen, but his job was here just to receive reports on the killers, which he then had to summarize for his superiors. So people who were actually going to be doing the act of killing. He was indeed aware of he knew what was going on. No one was questioning that. But his role in it was hardly an actor, a direct, immediate actor in what he was being charged with, that is mass slaughter. He was a cog in the machine, even though Hannah Arendt encourages us to move beyond just thinking of it in those terms. He was also being charged with deporting Polish Jews to the killing centers. And this wasn't his job, though. It was orchestrated by police and higher SS officials. Before this trial, no one would have attributed it to him at all, hence why he didn't really come up in the Nuremberg trials at all. If he was this, single architect of all of the killings of people in the East, of Jewish people in the East, why was he not the central figure at Nuremberg? And, another thing was that in Nuremberg, there were people who were dead Nazis who were tried in absentia. They weren't there, but they were still being tried. That didn't happen with Eichmann. And if he was this ultimate evil architect, he would have been tried at Nuremberg, but he wasn't. So, why all of this? Unless he was a good figure to pin all of this on for the Israeli court to justify Israel's existence and to consecrate within history the Holocaust, violence against the Jews, which is absolutely necessary, needs to be taught in every school on the planet, I think. But this trial was not the place to do that, I don't think. Now, also, of course, in the case of Polish Jews being sent to the killing centers, Himmler and Hans Frank, were really the ones responsible, were the real architects here. And also, they were trying to make him culpable or liable for the extermination camps themselves. Now, he obviously knew he was sending people to their deaths, but he did not choose who. Okay, he didn't choose who, so what? Whatever. He's still culpable. But not for murder. It was the physicians at the camps who decided, and the Jewish council who decided who would be sent, and the police who rounded them up. So the physicians would decide who would actually be fit for work, and who would actually be fit for sending to any specific kind of labor versus those who would be sent to the death camps. And the Jewish council was also responsible for actually helping the Nazis round up Jews, to convince Jews to get onto trains, to organize them. This is why she says that if it wasn't for their help, it's hard to imagine that as many Jews would have died. Also selling them the idea of them being sent to Palestine and forcing many Jews who did not want to leave, who saw their home in Hungary, in Germany, in Poland, because that's their home, and who actually didn't want to participate in the Zionist project, how they were treated differently than Jews who were willing to go to Palestine, willing to leave their homes. Well, willing. No. Oh, and I have to mention, because someone sent me a really great message, and I should have put this earlier, and I think they're totally right. I'm guilty of homogenizing European anti-Semitism and suggesting that as though everybody within Europe was anti-Semitic. When I got a comment from somebody, and I think that it's very important to highlight that is definitely not the case. Anti-Semitism was a huge issue, but there were many, many people working against the Nazis, fighting the Nazis, helping save Jews, keeping them safe, hiding them in their basements, sending them to their cottages away from the city, away from the Nazis. And I really want to highlight that, because it's not as though everybody was just culpable in this. And if I gave you that sense, I'm sorry if I wasn't clear. Now, as far as what they were trying to charge him with, being a mass murderer, the irony is that he was a mass murderer who never actually killed anyone, which is it's difficult. And Hannah Arendt is clear that this is, the court was doing something that was fundamentally new, dealing with genocide. We didn't know how to deal with that in a courtroom setting. So they were trying to figure out what to do along the way. They were building the plane as they were flying it. So of course, there has to be some amount of leniency given to them here, but we can't ignore the other driving factors, the other incentives behind this trial, behind the spectacle, behind the illegal kidnapping or abduction of Eichmann, his treatment at the trial, and so on. The lack of support given to the defense so that they could have highlighted that the specific charges laid against him were largely unfounded. Another thing that he was being charged with was the choice to exterminate all the Jews and not just those in the East, because the court had to make it seem as though Eichmann was this ultimate monstrous anti-Semite who just wanted to kill every single Jew, which I think as we made totally clear, he did not. He was not an anti-Semite in the way that they set it out to seem. It was a lot more complicated than that. He had strong associations with Zionist Jews in that they shared nationalist aspirations, so that automatically flies in the face of his just being an anti-Semite, especially because right now we see in the United States any effort to criticize Israel as being, or pass legislation to make any effort to criticize Israel as anti-Semitism. So in that case, because he supported the Zionists, does that mean he was not an anti-Semite according to these terms? And that's one of the real dangers of this conflation of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, is that it makes us lose sight of the many ways that anti-Semitism is indeed on the rise today, and it just covers over all of it in favor of this one idea about what anti-Semitism is, and reducing people's relationships to the divine, their religion, to a state, and filtering it through a state, and treating it as though, like in the case of the US, saying things that, like, without Israel, Jews wouldn't be safe. Like, if that is true, then we have so much work to do, and we should be focusing on that, not proffering up this single safe haven, because there are so many Jews who are anti-Zionist or who just never want to go and live in Israel. So just, increasing Israel's defenses and its military might is going to do nothing to save all of those other Jews. And if we just treat Israel as the one solution and we can, wipe our hands of it, that's it, figured it out, we are going to have so much more difficulty protecting our Jews that live in the US or, like where I'm from in Canada, who see these places as their homes, who have rich cultural histories there and need to be protected in their wanting to live there, not in their needing Israel to go and run to if things go sour for them, which they should never. And it's also like, these are the same ultra-right wingers who were like, had nothing wrong with Charlottesville and with white supremacists screaming in the streets about how Jews will not replace them. They had no problem with that. In fact, they were willing to defend it. Or Marjorie Taylor Greene and the Jewish space lasers thing. And like, it's just super interesting because we were the ones to criticize that, to be horrified by that, to identify the rise in anti-Semitism. But now when we criticize Israel for murdering 35,000 Palestinians, then we are the anti-Semitic ones? Like, what? Anyways, how do you really feel about this, David? Now, the last point that they relied on focused on the final solution, but specifically that in the East, where Jews were killed as early as 1939, before the court even recognized that Eichmann was involved, that Eichmann had any role to play, because he only found out about it a couple of years later. But these actions, the violence being inflicted against Jewish people in Poland, in Hungary, in Romania, predated his involvement. Now, discrimination against Polish Jews, like it predated Eichmann being in Germany, where they had to wear the letter P. So Polish Jews were branded with the letter P even before he had any role to play here. And then in the final years, because Auschwitz was in Poland, of course, like the horrors, the ramping up of the death chambers, absolutely horrendous. He had no part to play in that. Like any direct part to play in that at all. And his point, Arendt's point, is to say that Eichmann is still culpable. Like, she's not denying that. And the punishment is appropriate, but not on the terms the court worked from. And not, in the kind of spectacular way it laid out. And that puts us here into chapter 14, Evidence and Witnesses. Now, in the Jerusalem court, Hannah Arendt writes that defense witnesses could not be heard, and those of the prosecution could not be cross-examined. So this is totally unfair, that he couldn't have his defenses. He couldn't have witnesses on his side, and witnesses for the prosecution could not be cross-examined. The same was true at Nuremberg, where the defense had insufficient resources to comb through documents and information. Now, at the time of writing this, this had the effect of limiting public knowledge of the Nazi regime to those bits of info used for the purpose of prosecution. Because, think of the time. It was in a few years, 20 years or so after, less than 20 years, after the Holocaust, after World War II. People don't have phones or the internet to learn about this stuff. Chances are they'd learn about it in school. Chances are that knowledge would be limited. And so this was an opportunity to really, in a spectacular way, with cameras, with news reports, to tell the tale of the Holocaust for the world. And this had the effect of presenting a one-sided view of what had actually occurred, which isn't to say as though the Nazis had anything worth defending about them. That's not the point at all. But it did help erase the actual complicity of Zionist Jews during the Holocaust, or the various ways that racialized Jews or Eastern Jews were treated very differently than Western European Jews. And it also just erased the actual horrors and the specific people responsible in the specific ways that they achieved their goal here. They didn't exterminate the 11 million Jews that they wanted, but still, they succeeded at committing one of the most unbelievable horrors of all time. And it is so important for everyone to know exactly how this works, not just the specific details and the trauma dumping that went on at this court trial. And there are venues to do that. That is extremely important to maintain cultural and social memory about violence inflicted, but not in this setting. Now, Eichmann took to the stand for almost a month, and there was almost 2 months dedicated to just witnesses, that most of which had no bearing on the case at all, in Eichmann's role or anything, just describing how horrible the Holocaust was. Now, the witnesses had largely been Israelis who had been in at least one of the countries the Nazis had infiltrated, had occupied. 53 came from Poland and Lithuania, where Eichmann had little or no influence. 8 were from Germany, who had escaped before the war started. 5 were from Prague. 1 from Austria, 1 from France, 1 from Holland, Denmark, Norway, Italy, Greece, and Russia. 1 from each of those places. 2 from Yugoslavia, 3 from both Romania and Slovakia, and 13 from Hungary. And the court knew these witnesses' testimonies were irrelevant, but instead served, in their words, as just supplement or background information to quote-unquote paint a picture about what had actually happened. Now, the last witness was named, the pronunciation, Aharon Hotter Ayishai, and he was part of the Jewish Brigade in Palestine during British occupation. Now, what? Was he even in Europe? Why was he relevant? He was part of a task force to locate surviving Jews in Europe, to organize them for, in her words, illegal immigration into Palestine. So what? In this case, Hannah Arendt doesn't really know his relevance to the trial, but they used the Jews here and their desperation, at least this is what came out of this, to give them one option. And in her words, this was their one option: the road to what was then Palestine and was soon to become Israel. Let me say that again. In Hannah Arendt's words, the road to what was then Palestine and was soon to become Israel. So you see why maybe Hannah Arendt why she got so much hatred for this? Why she received so many death threats for this? I mean, saying something similar today would get you a similar fate. Now, to conclude this chapter and thinking about the witnesses, Arendt remarks on the only witness testimony to highlight German efforts to save Jews. Specifically, it recalled Anton Schmidt of the German army, who saved thousands or hundreds. I think it went into the thousands of Jews. Now, I don't really know what her point is about this, to say, well, there were Germans who were trying to do good things. Yeah, we know that. Or I don't know what the relevance of that would have been, other than to say that although resistance didn't translate to a change of mind among the SS, it is a sign for her of a kind of unkillable humanity, even within the worst place on earth at the time for Jews, as part of the most oppressive regime. How there were these glimmers of humanity there that I think she wants to highlight, to show, to give people a roadmap on how to act when confronted with a similar situation, to not participate in it. And, thinking about today and what's happening, what Israel is doing to Palestine, I think we are confronting something very similar, given the amount of time that's happened in 7 months and have 35,000 at least murdered people. Israel is about to embark on their invasion of Rafah. And it's horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying. And I think that we need to adopt her view here, that we have to oppose this. We have to oppose it with any way we can to try and stop Israel from murdering more people. To save them, but also to demonstrate, the humanity and what humanity means in the face of oppressive regimes. And that puts us here into chapter 15, Judgment, Appeal, and Execution. After the war, Eichmann was detained and interrogated by the Allied forces, and then he escaped. And they could never really confirm his identity, so he was able to get out. And when the Nuremberg trial was underway, he was like, now's the time. In 1946, he's like, I have to leave. And he got help from the Catholic Church, and it was only with the help of the Catholic Church that he was able to leave. Which, shouldn't they be on trial for this? I mean, they're helping a war criminal who committed genocide. And he fled to Argentina and assumed a pseudonym. Now, I'm not totally sure why Arendt is including this detail, but I think it's important to know nevertheless, but in this context, I'm not entirely sure. But she's curious why it took the Israelis about 13, 14 years to find Eichmann in 1959. They wouldn't arrest him till a couple years later, but why it took them till 1959, because he wasn't very secretive. He repeatedly boasted of his role and was among other Nazis in Argentina. In fact, Eichmann knew full well he was actually being shadowed, and this is another part of this that is kind of haunting. Eichmann knew full well that he was being surveyed and shadowed, and followed for months before his capture, but chose not to flee again, and he was essentially fine with the trial. He said that he was tired of actually being anonymous. He was tired of his anonymity. And he even offered to hang himself to liberate German youth from the guilt of their father's actions. And he put up no resistance at all after he was arrested. He wanted this to happen. And it wasn't because he wanted it to happen that it happened, that he was arrested, that he was illegally detained and deported. He didn't turn himself in, but he didn't put up any resistance when this happened. He could have tried appealing to his statelessness, could have tried appealing to the Argentinian government, but he didn't. And when he was detained, the Israelis got him to copy a pre-written letter consenting to his arrest, detainment, and trial. He denied their letter to instead write his own because he agreed with the terms, but wanted it to be his own. The point was to appease the Argentinian government for his being illegally kidnapped. Now, in the end, after the dust had settled at the end of the trial, Eichmann was found guilty of 12 of the 15 counts put against him, where the first count referred to was about, I don't know proper legal language. The first count was the killing of millions of Jews. The second count, placing Jews in conditions that resulted in their deaths. The third count, causing physical and mental harm to Jews. Fourth count, limit Jewish births. So 1 to 4 of the first 4 counts dealt specifically with his violence and actions against Jews. Now, the thing with counts 5 to 12 is that they do not specify genocide, which is bizarre, because Poles, Roma people, and disabled people were eradicated in the same way. So Hannah Arendt about this writes, all his acts against non-Jews were lumped together as crimes against humanity, whereas the crimes against Jews were treated just as that, as crimes against Jews. Which also, we should know why they went after Roma people as well. We should be offering Roma people their state to, make up for their many years of prosecution and violence. So specifically, charges 5 to 12 didn't deal with genocide. It clumped everything together. But count number 5 was kind of a recapitulation of the first 2 counts, that is killing millions of Jews and placing them in conditions that resulted in their deaths. The 6th count was about persecuting Jews on basis of race. The 7th count was the stolen property of the Jews. 8th count, committing war crimes. 9th count, displacing Poles. 10th count, displacing people from Slovakia. 11th count, displacing Roma people. 12th count, displacing children from Lidis and which was a Czech village. Or it might be Lidice. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. So, of this, Hannah Arendt writes that he was guilty of Roma extermination in exactly the same way as he was guilty of the extermination of the Jews. But that's not what this trial was about, which is why Hannah Arendt would come to argue that he should have been tried in an international court where Roma people could have been represented, Jewish people could have been represented, Poles could have been represented, the disabled community could have been represented as well. Now, in the face of his pretty certain death penalty conviction, Eichmann pleaded that he was not to blame because he didn't hate the Jews, which I think we've made sufficiently clear, at least not in the way the Israeli court was laying out. He was only following orders, was his plea. Now, in December 1961, he was sentenced to death. The next year, they tried to appeal with no success. Just a month later, they tried to appeal with no success. And in their remarks, the judges went further than the original court to paint Eichmann as the sole architect of the final solution, which the original court, in his original trial, was trying to do, but they really took on an extreme form when he tried to appeal his claim. They were like, because of his role in the final solution, this almost single autonomous architect behind it, there's no way we could accept this appeal. Now, despite pleas from the Central Conference of American Rabbis and profs at Hebrew University, he was hanged in May of 1962, where that was just 5 months after he was considered guilty, after he was found guilty, which was very hasty. Like he was put to death very, very quickly. Now, leading up to his hasty execution, he did not demonstrate fear nor remorse. He was calm, even when he was walking to his actual execution, calm, tranquil, and he had accepted his fate. Now, it is on this note that Hannah Arendt offers us the final lines of her book, where she writes that it was as though in those last minutes of Eichmann's life, he was summing up the lesson that this long course in human wickedness had taught us, the lesson of the fearsome, word and thought-defying banality of evil, where he didn't go out with a bang, per se, or with any fuss. He, just following the orders that the court had given to him, had just done his thing without demonstrating any remorse, any sadness for saying goodbye to his family, to saying goodbye to himself. And so I think that Hannah Arendt is inviting us to think about just how pernicious the banality of evil is, and just how easy it is, and even likely it is, for anyone to become an Eichmann, to be a person that is willing to stand by or to just be a cog in a genocidal machine without any thought in the world, without any care in the world, just following orders, just doing things as they're expected of them. And they might even be doing it to attain some personal end, to attain power, maybe to obtain land. But yeah, and that puts us here just into the epilogue. We're during it where she reflects much on the trial after having written it. And during and after the trial, there were 3 common criticisms of the trial. The 3 common criticisms were, number 1, Eichmann was tried under a retroactive law and appeared in the court of the victors. The retroactive law being not having a word or way to understand genocide that was being applied retroactively to what he had done, which, at the same time, you got to lend the court a little bit of credit or leniency because they were trying to fly the plane as they were building it. But it's important to consider nevertheless, especially in the way that genocide was sold in this court as being specifically against Jews instead of being a crime against humanity. The other part of that is that he was tried in the court of the victors instead of an international court, which would have made more quote-unquote objective sense. And the second criticism was that his abduction was illegal. Fair enough. The third criticism, that his being charged with crimes against Jews made the Jerusalem court too biased, and he should have had an international trial instead. Now, the court's response to the first one, that is, that Eichmann was tried under a retroactive law, it focused on the singularity of the crimes, that is, the uniqueness of the crimes within human history, and the need for new laws, which makes sense to me, but I'm not a lawyer. I don't know if this is actually a big problem within the legal world, but in any case, I mean, I don't know. It sounds right to me, but I don't know anything about it. But the issue that Arendt highlights here is that by framing it as crimes against Jews instead of crimes against humanity, in the case of genocide, the court was setting up essentially a global precedent not to hold people who had committed crimes against humanity accountable. So Arendt asks, she's like, why weren't the Russians, the Americans, or British charged with crimes against humanity? The obvious answer was that the international military tribunals, in her words, were international in name only, and that they were in fact the courts of the victors. You need only look at Dresden, where civilians were firebombed to death by the British forces, I believe, or the U.S. dropping nuclear weapons on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Where was the Japanese court that, is holding those people accountable for murdering hundreds of thousands of Japanese civilians in their cities, in their homes, being eradicated to nothing? Like, where is the universal standard here? Because, as soon as courts start being specific, especially international ones, start picking and choosing and not holding every country, every person who commits war crimes, who commits genocide as crimes against humanity accountable, then we have to ask whose interests are actually reflected in these courts. Now, and I mentioned earlier, which he brings up, is like, why wasn't he tried at Nuremberg? Martin Bormann was tried, even though he wasn't there. He was tried in absentia. But, given that he was apparently one of the architects behind the final solution, you'd think that his name would even come up, which it didn't, or was very rarely or sparsely invoked. But this extends way beyond war as well. Hannah Arendt, she asks us, she's like, well, imagine different circumstance in a different country. So the Israelis kidnapped Eichmann out of Argentina to bring him back to Israel for the crimes he inflicted against Jews. Imagine, for example, and this is Arendt's example, imagine if a leader, or if someone from the Congo, or Ghana, or the Ivory Coast sent some special agents into the Deep South in the U.S. to abduct segregationist leaders for the crimes that they've inflicted against black people and brought them to back to Ghana, back to the Ivory Coast, back to wherever, and help, so that they would be forced to stand trial there. We're just being objective and neutral and rational here. We're being equal on all sides. That should technically be okay then, because enslavement was a crime against black people, specifically black people of Western Africa, and all their children who would be born into enslavement, which was absolutely horrendous. But we don't see that conversation go on, because if the U.S. is prepared to justify the Israeli court and its treatment of Eichmann, then why doesn't the same apply to Western African nations holding segregationist leaders or slave owners, holding them accountable for their violence, which they should be held accountable, or they should have been, right? We're just being rational and objective here. And these courts could then say, well, Israel set the precedent. You can go into another country and kidnap someone who has committed crimes against your people. So the Israeli court was it was insufficient. It was ill-equipped. It was not appropriate to adjudicate charges of genocide, because genocide is an attack on people as humans, in their humanity, not in their identity. Israeli court conflated expulsion and discrimination with genocide, where the former terms account for specific identities to be expulsed. Like, these people were specifically expulsed for who they were. Now, the same obviously happened in the case of the Jews, but it wasn't just them. And there were many different, Jews who were being sided with. Jews who were, the Nazis were actually cooperating with, which flies in the face of that simple explanation. And the point, again, is not to say that there's anything redeemable about the Nazi Party or Eichmann. Like, absolutely not. But I think historically it's super important to actually understand all of the ways in which a Holocaust, a genocide, actually takes place so that it never happens again. So one of the things Adorno calls for in his thinking about education after Auschwitz. What do we have to learn to make sure that this never happens again? To make sure that 15,000 children aren't bombed to death in 7 months, for example. Now, in Arendt's words, she says that the very monstrousness of the events is minimized before a tribunal that represents one nation only. Where were the representatives for Hungary? Where were the representatives for Polish Jews, for Poles? Where were these people? Head of World Jewish Congress even proposed an international court comprised of representatives from all nations affected by the Nazis, but Israel shut that down. Ben-Gurion was going to make sure that wasn't going to happen. Now, Arendt's plea is that so long as Israel frames the genocide as a specific attack against Jews, the world will not see the true victim to all genocides, and that is humanity. And as our weapons get more efficient on the earth and more deadly, we need an international court more than ever, one that is actually impartial and that is able and capable of holding the most powerful nations accountable in order to protect humanity, to protect people in their humanity, to guarantee that people's first right is the right to have rights, and that this is respected for everybody. That is, this international court cannot just represent certain nations trying to try certain people for crimes inflicted against them. At least not in these terms. Now, the failure of the Jerusalem court can be explained with attention to 3 fundamental issues. The first is the impaired justice of victors. No witnesses for the defense and lack of sufficient resources and time to actually look through evidence and to create counterpoints, to cross-examine the prosecution's witnesses as well. Secondly, there was no valid definition of crimes against humanity. The eradication of Jews, Poles, Roma people, disabled people was more than any of their specific horrendous experiences on their own, like each one of them individually. What had happened was so much worse than that. And it's that logic of being able to dehumanize people to the point of eradicating them, of exterminating them, that needs to be accounted for and dealt with. Because that, Arendt is not convinced that that was sufficiently dealt with, and hence why these things can continue happening. Now, despite the court's claims, Eichmann wasn't a monster, right? Which connects to his, the treatment, or one of the other problems of the court was that he was treated as this kind of new criminal, like something that the world had never seen before, which we saw in Nuremberg. Those were the real architects, the absolute heads, the horrendous monsters that produced the Holocaust. But Eichmann was treated in a very specific kind of new way in this trial, where his monstrousness was highlighted, where his being this ultimate anti-Semitic, violent creature that crawled out of the pits of hell is the person on trial, when that is not the case at all. In fact, the real horror was that he wasn't those things, and yet was still able to participate in the eradication of the Jewish people, or the effort to eradicate all of them, and Roma people, and Poles, and disabled people. Now, to conclude the epilogue, Arendt summarizes the whole trial as the judges acknowledging Eichmann's lack of decision-making power, but that he must nevertheless die because he's the ultimate monster to humanity, but really just to the Jewish people, which haunts Arendt so much, especially because she knows that the land that trial was taking place, as she said, was once recognized as Palestine, where people once lived, who had lost their homes, many of whom lost their lives to some of the first terrorist regimes there, run by Zionist Jews, murdering Palestinian people and expelling them from their land and homes. And she's like, look at what is happening now. Look at how, without us actually holding the right ideological frameworks accountable, that is, ideological frameworks that reduce people to being less than human, look at how these people who claim and who were indeed victim to that very treatment are able to then do it against others. And just finally with the postscript, in which she lays out some things about like using certain translations. She relied primarily on English translations. She thinks the German transcripts and translations weren't that great, but she relies on the English one. She's like, I think that they were good enough in her actually dealing with the trial, and I think they were. I haven't seen anything about her mistranslating things, or there was a mistranslation that she consulted. She also wants to clarify that her focus here, despite because she got so much hatred, was that she had no interest in blaming Jews for the Holocaust, but just those Jews who actually participated, who actually aided the Nazis, especially in the early years, in sending Jews from their communities to concentration camps with the hope that they will eventually be settled in Palestine to, in her words, transform it into Israel. And she leaves some things open because she doesn't want to offer like solutions to these problems that she identifies. Like, how should someone be held accountable who's just following orders, especially in a military context? Should he have been tried in the Jewish state or in an international court? Should he have had a defense at all? Because the whole court knew that he was already guilty. Nobody was expecting that he was going to be left off the hook. That never would have happened in a million years. So what was it for anyways? And she also points to how the Israeli court was suspiciously lenient towards Israeli soldiers who massacred Palestinians in just a few years earlier in the Palestinian villages, which keeps happening. It happens almost every single day, even before October 7th, where Palestinians are either arrested or murdered in the West Bank or Gaza. The West Bank, where there's no Hamas, or no Hamas in political leadership, I should say. I said that. Someone's like, there is a Hamas there. Like, okay, well, yeah, but not in political leadership. Does this justify Israel's being able to send their armored cars and big machine guns and harass people on the street, arrest kids, which they arrest hundreds of kids every single year? But in Israel, they're prisoners, right? When they hold them there, they're prisoners. And so the international community is like, oh yeah, that's legit. Even though they're even though they arrest children, many of whom will never see a trial, many of whom might never see their parents again. And imagine that. Just imagine your own child. You're sleeping at home one night. The Israeli forces break down your door, take your child, and throw them in an Israeli cell, and you have no idea where they are, and you have no idea if you'll see them again. And would that bother you? I think it probably would. And of course the West Bank is filled with Israeli checkpoints and a wall. And for all those people who are like, oh, well, Hamas's attack was absolutely unprovoked. They absolutely were unjustified in what they did, which I'm absolutely willing to condemn Hamas, because absolutely the death of humans is horrendous. Absolutely horrendous. But I think that we should actually be able to contextualize this and understand it historically instead of pretending as though history just began on October 7th, where one day people just woke up and were like, let us inflict violence against the Israelis, or in the way that it's branded, violence against the Jews. And, let's just see. Let's try this checkpoint thing in Texas. Let's see how cool the Texans will be with that. Because clearly, if any of them are willing to justify Israel's onslaught against Palestinians, then they'd be willing to live under the conditions that Palestinians have been living in for 75 years and not be able to put up a fuss about it, while also being gaslit and told that their suffering isn't real and that they actually deserve it. I would love that to be tried somewhere in Texas. That would be, we could just see it unfold. I don't actually want this to happen in Texas because I don't want anyone to live through this. It's really as simple as that. And this is why Israelism is such an important documentary. If you haven't seen it already, go and watch it, in that it just puts, or go watch Anthony Bourdain's episode when he travels to Palestine and Israel. And he goes from Israel and hanging out in cool cafes. And I often wonder if the people in cool cafes in Israel can hear the Palestinians screaming for help and crying for their, for God to welcome them, and for, crying while holding their child, their dead child's body. And I wonder if those cool Israelis, I hear them screaming. I often wonder about that. But in Anthony Bourdain's episode, when he goes to Israel and is hanging out in the cool cafes and then goes into Palestine and is seeing all of the abuse that Palestinians experience on a daily basis by the Israeli forces, by Israeli settlers, that it's horrendous, absolutely horrendous. And it's something that I'm just so convinced, as soon as you confront it, you see just how simple this situation really is, and how it's not ambiguous at all. That the Palestinians are victims here, and we need to rectify this. But yeah, anyways, if there's anything I got wrong or anything I excluded, I'd love to hear about it. And yeah, I hope you're all well. On that note, take care.